And I'm going to do a PowerPoint in my style because I have a lot of ground that I want to cover. And my style, because I've been speaking to audiences with different language backgrounds for a long time, is to try to mostly speak the words that you see on the PowerPoint. So you can kind of follow me and hear me at the same time. And that way I can get through it and be efficient. Also, that's a way of me disciplining my mouth so we can get through our presentation. We've got different parts. We're going to have the first part and second part. In the first, we're going to first celebrate some of the immensely important scholars of the developing world. And I've got three I want to highlight. We're then going to talk about the emergence of a global financial dynamic and then get into discussion of the feedback loops for the financial crises and intersectional inequality, especially looking at the US. And basically, then we'll turn and briefly show the ways in which the mainstream and people linked to the mainstream have misinterpreted and interpreted upside down some of the phenomena that we're seeing, blaming the victims in ways that are historical. And then we'll have a intermission. And the intermission will basically be a brief picture history of January 6, 2021. And we'll then go from there into the exploration of the global architecture and power and finance, talk about the global hubs of two kind of contrasting hubs of global power, some implications, and then the last part, 7 through, I guess, 8, will be a discussion of some of the work that I've been able to do with colleagues at UNCTAD. Some of this is going to relate to what was talked about this morning and yesterday, so you'll see a lot of links. But let's start and let's get into it. And let's begin by, I want to mention the names of 3 giants who are among us. And you know, they call us post-Keynesians, and some people call us Marxians, and some people call us institutionalists and heterodox. And the fact is, we often refer to the foundational work of figures that are from Europe: Marx, Veblen, Schumpeter, Keynes, Kalecki. Historical figures, just a few. Long dead now, all were men of Europe. And to this extent, that's good. Those are reference points. But I think especially talking to a group here, where you are and who you are, I want to emphasize the need to recognize the giants among us. And some of these are people we've known, some have taught those who now teach us in these chains of transmission. Fernando, your teacher and our good friend. And closer to us, these are people in time and place. Their writings bring these foundational heterodox ideas to life, but fill them with the life and the issues that are there for the developing economies as well. These are not Europeans. And this is inspiration for us to do what I sometimes hear in Brazil. We can build on their ideas and invent what we need for the time to come. So these are men and women of the global South. I want to emphasize here 3. We'll just briefly touch on Fernando Cargin de Carvalho. I wrote a couple of pieces in his honor, and I'll just have one quote from him that's very inspirational on the next page. And I also just want to mention another fallen giant, Eugenia Correa, who died very suddenly in Mexico City in March 2021. I'm told by our colleague from Canada that he's got a paper he's working with that celebrates her work, and I would urge you to look into that. But I want to spend a little bit more time with Sunanda Sen. She is, of course, a retired scholar from JNU, New Delhi, now in her 80s. The other 2 have passed away, sadly. She recently won a book prize by the Japanese Society for Political Economy. And just to say that these are the names and heroes of heterodox thinking that are as important. It's not as widely read as it should be. Cargin is a legend in the global South, and he could pass unnoticed in many places in Europe and the United States. This is just true. Same thing is true for Sunanda and so on. Of course, it's breaking down, but basically it's our responsibility as people who are concerned and involved with the global South to honor those who teach us. And I mean people in this room who are your teachers every day. They're among the best, the sharpest, leading you forward. Respect them, honor them, work with them. Okay. They're Prebisch, Forzado, Conceição, and so on. I could tell you a story about Conceição talking to Fernando and I like we were schoolboys in a seminar, but I'll save that. So let's then go and just remember one thing from Fernando. Carvalho, he had a paper on Shakespeare and decision-making. And I just want to read this quote. A central question in all Shakespeare's plays is an exceedingly modern one, writes Fernando. How can any individual control his or her own destiny and give meaning to his or her own existence? The problem is choice, of course. But to be able to choose, one must be free. Freedom is the capacity to create one's destiny. Now, I would say let's interpret this in the context of your act of deciding that you're going to take seriously the study of heterodox economics. We can either use economic theories and insights that will chain ourselves to the past, that will enslave us, or we can use them to free ourselves so that we can face and even change the destiny of the world and its people. But let's think of that. Now, just a picture here, and I just want to say the following. Eugenia Correa was possibly the only human being in the heterodox tradition who had as many books as these two people right here. And so, Eugenia, I'm going to leave that there because there's much to be said about Eugenia. Many of the ideas that I'll be bringing in today appear in an essay that was just in a journal, I think it's in the readings, that I wrote at the provocation of Eugenia, and which unfortunately I had to deliver in her memory because she had already passed away. So let's focus a little bit on Sunanda Sen, because here's something very important. She's an anti-imperialist Keynesian. And, so she's a distinguished, national fellow and all this stuff. And she did all that. And this is my page that I put together so they could celebrate her for the book prize. They picked out these two recent books that she had published in the 2010s and gave her the prize in 2021. Now notice Changing Face of Imperialism and Dominant Finance and Stagnant Economies, just as the titles. And I want to say, let's just look at how Sunanda Sen constructed her Keynesianism and constructed her intellectual identity. She had actually a lifelong engagement with the ideas of both Marx and Keynes. Look at her very recent publications. Publishes a paper in 2020 in the JPKE on fundamental uncertainty, but that same year, a social scientist paper on the surplus approach of Engels and Marx. Audacious intellectual. She's identified with Keynes more than Marx due to her many writings on international finance and on the workings of the banking and financial systems. I think some of us are, we're identified as Keynesians for that reason. And but her relationship to Keynes was complicated. She was born in India under the Raj. And before that empire was swept away by the tides of history, whose waves are still being felt in that austere nation. And now, secondly, her work is also anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist. Covers both the historical roots of imperialism and the contemporary impact of capitalism's imperialist history. Her first two books, one's on India's bilateral payments agreements and Colonies and Empire, India 1890 to 1914, exposed the mechanisms and balance of payments implications of the unequal exchange between India and Great Britain in the colonial era. These books cross swords with Keynes. Keynes' first book, right, is this Indian currency and finance. What he describes in his book as features of the Indian monetary system, the non-convertibility of the rupee with advanced capitalist nations' currencies, the need for the depreciation of the rupee against the pound to avoid balance of payments deficits, are seen from the other side of the colonized as mechanisms of surplus extraction. Now, that came up in lunch today. You mentioned, or maybe before lunch, Louis Philippe was talking about seeing monetary policy as a vehicle for surplus extraction or conflict. And so in that spirit. So yeah, Sen embraced Keynesian ideas about fundamental uncertainty, liquidity preference, investment, aggregate demand, all the answers to the questions that you were asked earlier. in this morning's quiz about what's Keynesianism, and his support for the welfare state. But there's no discussion in the general theory about the class struggle over wages and working conditions, exploitation of labor by capital, or surplus extraction. This is his blind spot, right? Keynes' 36 book makes concessions to and uses the languages of the neoclassical marginalist theory. Malcolm X would say you use the language of the oppressor to oppress the oppressed. And if you look at it that way, there's something missing in that book. For many of Sen's generation in India, and especially those who studied in those days when she did, early 60s, late 50s, in Cambridge, surplus extraction, labor exploitation, sometimes by finance, cannot be erased from the dynamics of capitalism, nor can the fact that these dynamics are global in scope, and they involve the exercise of unequal power across borders, especially for global areas used for resource extraction in the periphery of core capitalist nations. Now, if you happen to have read any of my work over the years, you will note that I spend a lot of time talking about racism, talking about sexism, talking about redlining and discrimination in credit markets and the exploitation of people in inner cities because of the color of their skin. Also community development and all that. Now, at some point, I realized that the mainstream was not going to allow our econometrics to escape from the missing variable problems that we had. We couldn't identify specifically that these specific people over here were racist, exploiters. And so I realized that, well, if we're not going to convince that that's not winnable on its own terms, let's turn the lens of this camera around and understand who are these banks whose doors we're beating on, who will not make fair loans to us because we live in the inner city and we live in diverse communities and we are not people who look like what they expect us to look like. So let's see what that's all about. And that turned me onto what's become an agenda on power and finance, an unfortunate topic in the sense that not many people really want to talk about power, including Keynesianos. But this is what it is, and this is part of the thing. This is where one reason that Robert and I link together very well, because we see those lines of power in politics, in economics, in finance that have to be broken if we're going to make a change. Fadel mentioned that today. That's part of it. Okay. Sunanda's summary. One can conclude that not much has changed between the days of political subordination under old imperialism and the ideology-driven advances of markets for irrigation by the powerful in this new age of imperialism of current times. Not bad for a 79-year-old at the time, right? What is this new imperialism of current times? There's many dimensions. We're going to follow Sunanda and Eugenia and talk about the financial dimensions of global power. Just one more page on Sunanda. Her work, taken as a whole, shows that political subordination yesterday prepares the way for institutionalized economic domination today in the interest of ruling nations and leading to surplus extraction from those nations. Her renewing the term imperialism in her later work raises the question, what is it in the past and what is it today? And here we need Keynes, but we need a critique of Keynes at the same time. The colonial system that he accepted as part of an established reality involved layers of oppression and exploitation that Marx in Luxembourg would expose. But her writings do not lead to ready policy solutions. She reminds us that the grooves laid down by centuries of oppression need a reckoning, global reset. We got a global crisis ongoing, and it only makes it more urgent that we see our problems whole. That means history in the picture. And that's why every time you pick up one of Gutmann's books, he's going to kill you with history, because he's going to say, you need to understand this. You want to understand that. Okay, this makes the obvious point. If you're writing from the perspective of the subcontinent, you've got this to deal with. Neil Ferguson and these people, and then Hart and Negri, and good Lord. Basically, Sunanda Sen's scholarly explorations show how India is caught between the wheels of empires in what the French regulation economist Alain Lippietz called the enchanted financial world. I talked I'll leave that aside. Apparently he's writing poetry now, Lippietz. That's what our friend in Paris says. Anyways, much loss for us. Okay,
political tragedy behind all of that.
Yeah, I imagine. Okay, so the emergence of the dynamic, we're gonna go fast here because this is things that we've known and you heard something about yesterday and the days before. The international financial markets evolution has been shaped by many things, and I want to point out two. One is the asymmetric current and capital account position of the United States from the 1980s onward. And we saw something in earlier talks about the dollar system and its evolution, and you can kind of like attach all of that right here. Secondly, there was a restructuring of global banking. This is a step-by-step shift from a tightly regulated to a deregulated banking in the US. It led to too big to fail guarantees for US money center banks in 1984, a guarantee that the magic 11 would never be allowed to fail. And if you look at the magic 11 and dot the lines, I did that. I did a book on global merger wave and US merger waves. The big four plus the six, the other two, that was guaranteed. Now, European nations, meanwhile, moved to deregulation, the big bank financial market reforms to keep up. Japan assured that its big banks survived their asset and real estate meltdown. So there's some consequences of these efforts to save and preserve and underwrite those big banks. First of all, here's a picture. We'll just look at a couple of pictures here. Here's the systematic current account deficit of the United States. From what's the year now? 1980 until more or less the present. Just take a look. The US has been in current account deficit through the entire neoliberal era. What does that mean? That means that they are what I call a global liquidity sink, right? Surplus on capital account. Now, we're going to come later to something called safe assets, so get ready for that. And so that basically, of course, when you look at the growth of shadow banking, securitization, are they geniuses in Wall Street? Well, shit, no, they got to do something with all that money rolling in. And, you know, securitization works. Distribute those assets. Okay, next. This leads to and underwrites the emergence of a set of too big to fail mega banks, right? The money's rolling in. They've got a merger wave going on, and they're competing globally across financial markets. They build this shadow banking empire that supports the subprime bubble and survives its crash. So here's a picture of the size of these banks. And I just want to note that, you know, there is this competition, right, globally. Now, we could take this further and make a lot of comments, but right now, let's just notice that they all got really damn big and at a pace far greater than the growth of GDP. That has to do with that shadow banking growth and the competition for those markets. But here's another picture. So you see that there's a picture there, and the one that kind of knocks down there's Great Britain in the Great Crisis, and Germany's kind of got a knockdown there too, and so on. But just look at this next picture, and as a share of home nation GDP. Now, whereas the United States, well, so this is the same picture, assets only divided by GDP as a percentage, I guess, yeah. And whereas the US was clearly one of the dominant ones before, notice now that the US is that little snake at the bottom. It's a big advantage for them. They got a big market, right? They got a lot of resources they can use to support those banks. So it's a triple advantage. Their asset size is low relative to GDP. Their country's a global liquidity sink, and they're backed by the global lender of last resort. No wonder they're winning that game. And, you know, the shadow banking system, meanwhile, just a couple of things here. Okay, it now equals or exceeds conventional banks in the volume of credit extended. So market-based credit has replaced bank-based credit as central bankers' main concern. If we read even a lot of people in INA, there's a lot of discussion, including my friend Perry Merling, who likes to talk about how that's a bridge that's been crossed and this is a new system, and Schiller and so on. But be careful, that's a very US specific phenomenon. And in Europe as well, we see that growth of shadow banking, where those MFIs on the left-hand side, that's the monetary financial institutions that are not the banks, they're the other ones. And basically you can see that they've taken over a lot of domination in those markets. Now, since the crisis, just a couple of pictures to say, yeah, there's been some reforms to prevent a new subprime bubble, and the actual subprime or the actual market-based securitization is way down. But as a consequence of the tighter rules on bank leveraging, the consequence of these rules have not been accompanied by significant changes in shadow bank regulation. That remains a problem. And you see this picture here of overnight reverse repos. This is the obsession of Danielle Gabor and her work. But you notice how jumpy this picture is, because these people are always making, getting into trouble. And it's a little bit like that old movie, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Where these couples have to keep dancing through the night. Everybody's got to move that circle of rehypothecated money around, because if they don't, oh my God, the rates will shoot up incredibly, and the Fed is always there to back them out. But that means, back them up. But that means that the Fed, the central bank, the global lender of last resort, is in the money markets every day. It's now the foundation of the global money market. The global money market is hyper leveraged. Rehypothecation, according to BIS, no more than 25, actually 16 times. It was 25, they knocked it back to 16. That means there's one actual treasury supporting 16 money market borrowings that are actually just made out of air. And that's what allows that globalized financial system to float above the surface of the earth. Okay. So quantitative easing, the way people are talking about monetary policy now is ridiculous, because actually they talk about like it was 1981 or 1979. Well, hell no. This is a system in which basically the advanced economies, central bank balance sheets, and their sort of normal days are over. They're now in those markets. And so we have this problem of evolving liquidity, supporting, distributing liquidity that have pulled these central banks into the base of the money market. And the banks count on these central banks to be there for them, to support, to backstop their position taking, to provide reserves on demand whenever needed. How many countries can do that? Now, for that, we don't need a reserve, we don't need a currency hierarchy model, because it's a very simple thing. It's a one is the loneliest number, So 911, Ben Bernanke, right? But the mechanism is the birth repo. Let's leave that aside. And this just shows you one last picture here, that the repo market, look how jumpy this thing is. There's haircuts, there's the rates on the left, and the kind of volumes on the right. And really, it's just to say that the repo market is a troubled market, my friend. And basically, they do what they can to avoid complete meltdowns because they have to. If those partners in that desperate dance stop dancing, that whole system crashes. And what that means is that while there have been reforms, they can continue to do lots of funny things. Here's the leveraged loan market. It's just a picture from 2017, mid-year, and it just shows you who the players are in that leveraged loan market. And for me personally, as somebody who tried to fight against redlining and tried to fight against subprime lending, and then watched the damn system collapse, same names, playing around in a leveraged loan market, which is basically a loan market in which nobody has to give any collateral, and you can use the loans for any purpose, like SPACs. Leave that right there. Okay. Now, this all then goes in the direction of international financial integration. This increased over 25 years, and it's made debt-led growth a defining feature of global macroeconomics. This pattern of cross-border flows reflects and reinforces global patterns of stagnant macro growth and declining provisioning capacity. The current account deficit of the US, which is the structural anchor of the neoliberal world, has been more than offset by the export surpluses of China and some European nations. But the result is that developing nations have been thrown into systematic deficit. This is a structural fix, a structural situation. The net investment position of the US steadily declines. Those of developing nations stay in deficit or worsen, but everybody's got to adjust. That's at the global level, cross-border balances. There's only one world. In principle, all these balances got to add up. That means if somewhere is in deficit, somewhere else is in surplus. So the consequence is that the fiscal capacity of developing nations to fund efforts to achieve SDGs or to counter climate change are already severely damaged before we get to COVID and before we get to the Ukrainian war. Many governments cannot even provide for the basic welfare of their citizens. Now, here's a picture, and the line I want to direct your attention to is the dark dotted line. This is the current account balance of the emerging and developing economies minus China. It goes from surplus to deficit. Meanwhile, you see the United States, of course, is reliably deficit because we're the global consumer of last resort, as was proudly said at a lunch table at Brookings in the 1980s when I was there. And meanwhile, the other advanced economies are doing the surplus thing. But that means, right, that you're systematically in deficit. When you have more deficit problems now, they get worse and worse. And meanwhile, here's your net investment position. There's some countries that are doing all right, but the United States is getting worse and worse. And there again is that dotted line. The emerging and developing economies minus China are in net deficit. All right, now we're going to get to more about that. And just a picture here, one consequence, this slide comes one page early. This is just something that shows you that remittances have exploded, and especially Europe, US, et cetera. And now, feedback loops. National governments in the global West stand then between two force vectors. The demands for stable returns made by owners of globally mobile capital who are unaccountable and undertaxed and denizens of tax havens, apparently, and their citizens and residents' need for well-being. They're stuck between these. Increasingly frequent and severe financial crises after the 1970s have forced sovereign nations, governments, to reassure markets with bailouts, to mollify the IMF by disciplining macroeconomic policies, or both. So the policies that sustain circuits of globalized finance and wealth, and the policies required to preserve communal well-being are increasingly in conflict. Meanwhile, developing nations in which repeated financial crises have occurred have less capacity to function as developmental states. I don't have to tell you how that's played out in Brazil. Development economies' capacity to use financial mechanisms and central banking policy to protect its financial sector or fund its real sector is limited. Think about how many bank failures of the magnitude that you saw in the global financial crisis have there been in Brazil? And ask yourself, why not? Think about that. Think about what you got to balance there. As state capacity is ground down in developing nations, more of their residents seek income or new lives elsewhere, so economic migrants grow in number. Now go back to that picture of all those folk pulling money from the global north. And of course, those are figures that stopped there in 2016. There's further data, but it comes with a lag from, I think it's the World Bank. Now, this further unbalances the conditions for stable income earning and public good provision in destination nations, the global north, worsens conflicts over resources that play out across intersectional divides of race, ethnicity, and national origin. Within the migration target nations, the global north, blaming the other becomes more central in national political discourse. Elected governments that can no longer satisfy their population's demands for material well-being instead pursue policies that validate intersectional rage and revenge. Those in subordinate rungs of this stratified society, race, ethnicity, gender, so on, are squeezed hardest as welfare cuts and unemployment take hold. This is justified by the idea that they are the undeserving poor who take from the host society and deserve no mercy and no protection from market forces. Implications. Many of those with intra-society positional power, instead of seeing this as a problem of historical exploitation, like to say it's identity politics. It's poison, right? That word is poison. Woke. Hell. The overall pattern of decline is the problem, not the spatial disadvantage of the subaltern. Now, and I gotta say that, there are naive economists and there are subtly evil economists, and I'm gonna mention two. One is the sainted Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton, in his new book, Nobel laureate, writes a book that highlights the declining health and income of the average white man. Okay, yeah, fair enough, that's right. If it's the average white man that's the problem. And then speaking of more evildoers, we have Calomaris and Haber in Fragile by Design, who make the argument that subprime lending was caused by the fact that the government forced the banks through the Community Reinvestment Act to make loans to households that couldn't afford them. Lie, lie, lie. Lie. That son of a bitch is the dean of the Columbia Business School. Dean of the Columbia Business School, and he writes that book, and it's well appreciated. The Community Reinvestment Act. You know how hard we fought for that damn thing? So that the banks had to report what they were doing in our neighborhoods where they wouldn't make loans, or when they finally make loans, they make exploitative loans that rip people's hearts out. And take a look at my student Hanna Zimborska's work on what's happened to the net wealth of black and white households in the United States. All right, now, state interference with market processes, right? That's the terminology. Financial frictions. It's blamed for the crises that ratcheted public services downward. So let the markets work. Purify society by punishing the unworthy or disenfranchising them, like in Georgia, or throwing their asses out. Stratification efficiently identifies subaltern groups whose consent is not needed for political control. It simultaneously identifies those who can provide insecure, low-paid labor for the economic growth machine and who belong to society's margins. That's something that the UK is too dumb to figure out, but that's another story. Many of the latter join this floating workforce of migrant laborers. Go to the Central Valley of California, right? And look at the community, the colonias there, of migrant workers, farm workers, domestic workers who could not afford to live in something other than tents in the dust of the desert. California, prosperous place.
The delivery guys of the suddenly omnipresent digital economy in New York City.
Yeah, thank you. The political disenfranchisement and invisibilization of those most victimized by declining state services makes financial crises less costly for elites, loosens controls on finance, makes them more likely. Right, so you see the contradictions. The inability of governments overloaded by bailout-related debt to restore former levels of national well-being feeds politics of anger and blame the other dynamics. Violence against minorities and migrants substitutes for class solidarity. Now, we're going to have a brief thing here, then we're going to do the intermission. It's going to be a short intermission, and you're actually not going to be permitted to go get popcorn. So sorry for that. Now, this part, anything but power, we now say, well, this dual dynamic is ignored in mainstream models of financial crises. In the 80s, large-scale crises in developing economies were attributed to moral hazard. Borrower nations default when non-payment penalties are set too low. Actually, Joe Stiglitz, in one of his articles, writes that. So don't think it's, people that have, you have to be careful and hold these people to account when they get those big, shiny prizes. Then blame shifts in the 1990s to financial market conditions, sunspot models, sudden stop. And so on. Small changes in beliefs by investors could cause these things. The next step, post-GFC, was to posit, and this is Claudio Borio, that financial openness in a world of deregulated, market share hungry financial funds leads to global financial cycles. They come like the winds. The wind was called Mariah, right? And you can't stop it. Monetary policy has no effect. The impossible trinity is dead. Right, says Ray, and only a dilemma remains. Developing countries' only choice is how open they want to be to capital flows. Now, this leads to this literature on global shortage of safe assets, and another person who's in a special place in my personal hell is Caballero. I think he's a Chilean, but good Lord. Anyways, there's excess global demand for riskless assets. So this is the analysis, right? There's a global shortage of safe assets. I saw, my colleague Bowder, Roland Bowder, just about lose his lunch and punch one of these people at a table at the ASSA meetings. But that's the thing about Willem, he doesn't pull punches at all. But basically, the idea is there's a global excess demand for riskless assets. We're in a world of risk, my friend, and we want to be safe. So foreign savers can find them in the US. This explains the US current account deficit. It's demand driven. Can the US be the global consumer of last resort? Because everybody wants what we have: security, safety. That's what we can give you. And basically, underdeveloped financial markets cause global financial cycles. Whole thing turns upside down. Note the irony that a shortage of safe assets, US government securities, can be solved temporarily by continuing the continuation of large US public deficits and huge current account deficits. There is no alternative. Now you're going to write on the future of capitalism, my friend. Good Jesus. Now the other thing they talk about is excessively expansionary monetary policies. They thought they put the silver stake in the monetarists back in the 1980s, but they kind of missed the heart. And now we got these global monetarists. So the excessive financial elasticity of domestic policy regimes exacerbates their inability to prevent the buildup of financial imbalances or outsized financial cycles. That's Borio. So Borio's more Keynesian view emphasizes that excessive risk-taking in the financial system is underwritten by overly permissive regulators. Well, what else are they going to do? They promised them, 20, 30 years ago, 40 years almost, that they were going to save their butts when they got in trouble. So why should they care? These ahistorical accounts, such as Borio's and Helene Ray and so on, are convenient. And Helene Ray is an efficient Marxist person. Read her work carefully. She thinks that global financial cycles allow a more efficient allocation of global capital. Read it carefully. Borio's one thing, Ray's another. London Business School, very fancy. Okay, so these ahistorical accounts are convenient facades for elites that can protect their economic privileges by insider influence, escape to tax havens, or do both. Developing countries' risk and subaltern position in global markets reflects histories of power and control, legacies of imperial powers taking land and needing labor to build edifices of exploitation and plunder. Now, this is one, we're going to kind of skip this because it's what if you want to look at it later, what it shows you is like, is there a pattern here? This is an IMF rendering. This is wonderful. Levan and Valencia, a couple of papers where they count up financial crises. And just pay attention to which part of the world seems to have a lot of them. I wonder. Latin America, what a scene, Okay. So, meanwhile, okay, now it's intermission time. You ready? Let's take a little ride, and then we're going to wake up, throw a brick at our friend here in the front row. Say, Camila. Not yet. But you're ready. But watch this, committee. You're going to like this. Here you go. Donald Trump, President of the United States. WTF, right? Okay, the Unite the Right rally, 12th of August, 2017, Charlottesville, Virginia. Does that remind you of Nazi marches in Germany? It should. Does it remind you of Ku Klux Klan marches in the old South? Or was it, oh, wait a minute, Virginia's in the South? Is that the new South? They kill a counter demonstrator run over by a car in the following day. Donald Trump's reaction, there were good people on both sides. Both sides. That's 2017. This leads to January 6, 2021. The assault on the U.S. Capitol by supporters of Donald Trump, who wanted to take back Trump's victory by force, stolen by election fraud. Now, actually, I should go harder on this thing here, but I'll leave it. There's U.S. senators and reps taking shelter as rioters try to break down the doors. There's these fucking fools. But then some of them are in prison. That young man on the right is apparently a vegetarian with a delicate, he needs whole food.
Yes, you got it.
And his mother tried to save his ass, but they still threw his ass in jail.
Cue them Shana.
Yeah, exactly. And so, now some of these people are being, but they are multiplying. As my brother Ted used to say, their sons will live on. And President Trump saying there were good people on both sides in 2017, he appealed to America's open wounds from the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. That's the war that it took to get the breakaway Confederate Southern states where there was most of the slavery by then, to give that up and come back to the Union. Long story there. But what we see here in that flag, that's the battle flag of the Confederate States of America from that war. Interesting. It went into open rebellion against the United States in 1861, defending their economic system, because that system in the South rested on plantation labor provided by slaves transported in British ships, mostly from Africa. Now, look at this picture. Just put it in your mind. Trump signals his solidarity. This is where I should rewrite this harder. He actually sets this goddamn thing up to white supremacists committed to beating down Black Americans. Many frustrated people rally to his cause, make America great again, just like you guys can't wear the Brazilian yellow football shirt anymore. These fools with their MAGA caps, what the hell, right? Since the Civil War, the right of Black and minority Americans to vote and to equal economic status were suppressed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made this illegal. The sitting Supreme Court says it's no longer a problem. I'll stop there, otherwise I'll get into another rant, start pounding this table again. But okay, look at the picture, look at the picture. That's a photograph. That's a photograph. Look at the flags. Okay, now watch. We go from the present photograph to a painting of one of the climactic moments of the American Civil War. It looks like the same damn picture, doesn't it? But even that has been challenged. Blaming Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, immigrants for all America's problems has remained a living legacy to this day. Trump exploits it. And I just said you don't need to hear me say that again. So, Republican Party, this is The Guardian, calls this legitimate political discourse. This is a year later. And we'll finish our slideshow with, now I'm going to finish the lecture with we're going to revisit Mr. Senator Josh Hawley, who, by the way, went to Harvard University and is one of these people like McCarthy and these other people in the Republican side and Ted Cruz, who are basically betting everything. They apparently are smart people, but good Lord, they will sell themselves. So he was, I've got this. I was thinking about changing this. This is taken, the caption there is taken actually from a newspaper account, I think in the New York Times. Josh Hawley, the US Senator from Missouri, was branded a traitor for his clenched fist salute, I misspelled clenched, to Donald Trump supporters before the clash in 2021. He's about to enter the building. Okay, keep that one in mind too. And now, but the clenched fist. And this is Donald Trump 5 days ago?
Yes, 4 days ago.
New York City.
Going to the position where you took the fifth 442 times.
What a fierce, determined set of men we have here. Aren't they warriors for justice? WTF. Part 2, my dear. Okay, no, it's a break. Okay, we're going to go right away. You're going to set us up?
Yes.
She makes me pay 5 EAs every time.
Okay.
But do you support Trump or not? It wasn't clear.
He supported Bolsonaro.
I just can't decide. I remember when I was somewhere in Brazil and everybody was giving me the condolences on the election of Trump. And I, just saying, oh, even Orero. Oh, it would be Orero, right? But well, let's leave it aside.
Yes.
But I didn't respond fire with fire. Okay, let's go to part 5. We've got to hurry up a little bit, but I just want to say we have less to cover here, so don't be calm. We'll take a little bit over an hour. So now onto the global architecture of power and finance. An alternative understanding of this unstable global financial dynamic emerges. But we take a post-Keynesian macro framework and allow for asymmetric power. And basically, I want to attach power to the post-Keynesian frame. And we have to talk about it across national borders and also inside nation states. If you're interested, you might know some of my work. I could point you. I've been trying to come up with the idea of spatialized Minsky dynamics and trajectories as an important part of kind of taking Minsky and bringing him into the broader set of problems, because he kind of really never came out of that hole of the 1960s, 70s America that allowed him to think about how you could stabilize the unstable economy with big government and big banking. Okay, leaving that aside. So here's the scenario. US dollar and US investments have been a safe haven since the 1980s. The Federal Reserve's international lender of last resort has conferred positional power on the US. They have the ability to define the rules of the game in this period. Now, let's say this period. Stay tuned on that. Global deregulation has permitted the rise and global penetration of US megabank-centered shadow banks. You know, Europe thought it was going to make the Eurozone so they could compete globally, be globally competitive, but they got a central bank that doesn't know how to pull the trigger on its things, and there's no central bank for all of the European banks, no matter how big they are nationally chartered, and there is no German currency, there is no French currency, there is only the euro. So, right, the advantage on the regulatory side to the US banks is total. Look what's happened to Deutsche Bank. Now, they had a bunch of corrupt and terrible people in that bank, but, you know, couldn't happen to a nicer group of people, but it was also foretold. They couldn't do what they were going to do. Read, and not to mention the informational advantages. Somebody's talking about information asymmetry. Go read that book, what's called, the name is not going to come to my mind. Okay, I'll come back to that. But basically that the German banks were gamed, Commerzbank in particular, by Wall Street traders who were selling them subprime securities while they were offloading their own portfolios. Oops, asymmetric information. Now, this positionality of the US allows it to be a global consumer of last resort and avoid a very spoiled nation of people, systematically living beyond its means for 40 years. But this is historically contingent and requires that the US itself reliably sustain this system's rules. Now, I got a note here. Just for the record, even our deregulated, broke ass, to use the Southern US expression from African American heritage, tax haven rich, social accountability denying, speculation seeking global financial architecture, right? That's what we got. Even that has invisible rules that its non-hegemonic hegemon has to follow. Go read Katerina Pistorius, and I remember the name, Lee Buchheit, on this. And by the way, they laid down those rules. The rules of how the subprimes were divided and what happened were laid down in the Latin American debt crisis. Lee Buchheit, and I got a paper that brings his writings forward, but like that whole plan was laid out when they had, what did you say it was, Robert? It was 224%.
225% of the 9 largest banks, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, their debt was at that point, 1982, 225% of the 9 largest American banks' capital.
So they had to save their assets, and they worked it out, and that remains. And they worked it out by ignoring the rules. There's a higher set of rules, and everybody's got to play. Can't have any wilting vines. Everybody's got to step forward and be part of the cabal. And the cabal is called, we got our own rules. We don't give a shit what your national rules are. And that's what happened to subprime. How come they don't cram down the subprime mortgages so people can afford them? No, because there's other holders of that paper, and they're in the magic circle of tax haven money. That's sacred money, my friends. Got to protect that 1%. Okay. I don't think I'm bitter enough. I need to get more bitter. But here's rule number 1. Cash flows across the borders of financial hub nations have no citizenship and require no passport and cannot be blocked. That's a rule, right? That's a rule of that new order. But, London grad, freezes on Iranian and Russian assets. That's a problem, isn't it? We'll come back to that. Now, the result here, and this is going to just, let's honor the amazing work. If you do nothing else in your life, if you get into the financial realm, go find the books of Jane DeRista and read them all.
Totally agree.
She understood and she called it the parallel banking system in a book that Bob Poland and I did, or edited in 1993, I think it was. She called it the parallel banking system like 15 years before anybody else even knew to think about it. This woman is unbelievable. And she's got a 2018 book, and she said, look, it's a global pyramid. Only the country at the top can stop crises when they occur across the borders. So global holdings of US liabilities support financialization globally, increasing the returns to financial predation and speculation. I have to say that Warren Mosler also is onto this. You know, like, we win because you're holding our liabilities and we get to consume. So screw you, we're on top. He gets that. That's one of those consequences that partly this cross-border thing, of course, that goes to the stuff that Lavoie and Godley worked out, that, you know, look at the balances, and they're big on this at Levy, important stuff to look at to understand those systems. Okay, where the money goes depends on where the opportunities are, growth or asset bubbles. You get to pick. And on global macrostructural balances, the secular stagnation of advanced nations since the global financial crisis, right? They got to April 2009, they're like, all right, now we need to stay in this thing like, then we get to September 2009, they're like, we're done. Boom, let's go and let's just go into austerity. And they do, and that leaves a global trace. Europe goes into austerity, and what else happens? Well, basically, we have secular stagnation, as beloved US economists call it, and in advanced Western nations, and that turns the developing economies from current account surplus to deficit. Again, I emphasize this point one more time. You are in structural deficit when you need to borrow more than because of COVID or because of the oil shocks and Ukraine and all of that. It's even worse. But where does that come from? That comes from the global structure of the financial macro economy. It's a fact, as Michael Kumar said when he talked about endogenous money creation. Okay, so we end up with double hubs of global power. And today, and this is something that's elaborated in that paper I did with Nicole, Cerpa-Vielma, that's coming out, just out, sort of, in the CJE. One extreme position is the financial core of the global system, the US itself, the safe haven of the US dollar in the world of financial crises. And mega banks can underwrite their global risk, earn fees, and exchange zero-sum bets with firms that are too big to manage. At the other extreme is the manufacturing core, East Asia, and especially China. Don't discount Japan, Korea, and so on. You know, it's in Taiwan. It's not just China, but it's a complex there. No time for details now, but these are interdependent cores. U.S. dependence on East Asia's exports and East Asian reliance on U.S. consumer and investment markets. So there's an extensive peripheral margin whose member nations have risks along both dimensions, along provisioning dimensions, and they have financial fragilities too. Now, this gets us to implications. The first one is Latin American financial trap. Nations at or near the core of both of these poles of vulnerability are immune from speculative attacks. So the US and China, and for that matter, Japan, they're not going to be subject to speculative attack. But nations, especially in the middle income category, are exposed. India is exposed. Brazil is exposed, Argentina, and so on. Globalized financial firms will use speculative financial attacks to take gains, exploiting these nations' thinner exchange rate and asset markets. And so this gets into the financial subordination thing that a couple readings from Nina and a couple of her partners in the reading section. And again, I won't elaborate because I got enough to talk about, but just to say, check it out, and it's systematic and it's structural. So nations can avoid this, maybe, by exercising defensive power. This was mentioned a little bit this morning. The power to be left alone, defensive power. You can have inward capital controls. That's even Helene Ray and the IMF talk about that. You can require that there be a productive use of any foreign capital or FDI, et cetera, that you bring in. Or you can build up your stocks of foreign reserves. I've had a really complicated discussion with Norberto about this in the past, about why Brazil stayed open. And that's, again, that's another conversation that we can get into. But basically, if you're going to stay open, you better have some reserves. I mean, some reserves, not just like little dinky reserves. You'll be able to beat those suckers off. And that's something that you'll see. And actually, Nicole and I did some work that I think is shown up in that CJE paper, where in every Latin American country, you've got a deficit on current account, but you've got an increase in reserves. Systematic. Think about, why is that? I better have those damn reserves. Does that mean that you are basically borrowing more so as to buy other people's assets? Hell yeah, that's exactly what it means. Why are you doing that? Because you're a fool? No, because you want to protect your nation. From what? From that wonderful market space that's looking for people to rip off. Now, nations therefore have to overborrow to protect themselves, even as their current account balances deteriorate. So Latin America gets trapped in a peripheral position on both financial and industrial dimensions, and its nations, of course, remain dependent on the export of commodities. The result is to create extremes of wealth and poverty, leading to ever-increasing financialization, increasing political frustration, and volatility for the voting public, which is asked to turn away from the criminal that runs your country. Here's just two pictures. There's your Latin American position. There's the current account, and just for the Latin America as a whole, dipping down negative, just like that other pattern. And there's your assets being acquired on the other side. And there's our net international investment position deteriorating. We take on the assets, and by basically taking on and selling our other assets to other people. Okay. Final page of implications, then we got one short section on green economy stuff, and I'll be done. So, the global north, provisioning crises and instability in developing countries, indices and politics have generated flows of economic migrants to advanced economies. Governments cannot reassure embittered citizens, extend human services to all, keep guest workers out of the country, and supply their labor-intensive sectors with low-wage disposable labor. This encourages the rise of nationalist, anti-foreigner political movements across the global north, with paranoid ideas bringing ghosts out of the closet, white supremacy, national socialism, Holocaust denial. Those in subaltern positions in the stratification structure have to relive their histories of ethnic and racial violence, exploitation, and oppression. This blocks any global response to climate change or enhanced human provisioning, because these are the fools that get elected. Look across much of the map of the global north at who holds the keys to power. Your wonderful Trudeau accepted. He's not, Jesus Christ superstar, but man, compared to these other people, good Lord. All right, now, I'm going to take you a little bit into the world of some of the work with UNCTAD. So let's turn from global financial power imbalances to human and planetary need. This need is summed up now in the UN's Millennial Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and in the notion of a global Green New Deal. Countries' climate risk and human development levels are inversely related to their fiscal capacity. Those with the most need have the least fiscal capacity, the least policy space, often can only borrow at subsidized rates, on concessionary rates, and so on. So any credible effort to undertake GND, like Green New Deal investments, must simultaneously provide cross-border finance for the SDGs. It was pointed out by Rogerio yesterday that we also have an issue of what do we need to finance? But let's assume that we have some answers to that. How are we going to finance it? And they got numbers. I'll show you in the next page. UNCTAD has numbers. Global summits on climate change and SDGs, including Glasgow in 2021, set targets and make commitments. It's what they do. So a key question is, can the existing global financial system finance the global GND and SDG efforts? Well, there's two big proposals on the table. There's one big proposal on the table, blended finance. This was much celebrated in Glasgow. And then we'll talk a little bit about SDRs, special drawing rights. It was an idea reinvigorated due to COVID-19. I'm borrowing here from that paper. There's a paper I did with Penny and from Penelope Hawkins and Gissell Huaccha, who are co-authors. We presented at Berlin. It's not exactly finished, so it's just sitting there as a kind of working paper, but it should be in the portfolio. So blended finance, what it is private capital is advanced to undertake some good purpose, and then public lender comes in basically and underwrites it. So you de-risk the commitment. So that's marvelous. You just made it a safe asset. Of course, the country took it on because I'm sure the Philippines would like to have the sovereign risk so that they can take care of the legacies and centuries of oppression, and basically that now work out to the fact that it's hard to live and to think past the global warming and sea change rise and all that. But that's okay. We'll take that risk because we're nice people. But that's what they're proposing. In fact, they're also talking about having the multinational development banks shift from making loans to being underwriters. That's a proposal made specifically by, am I ahead of myself? I'm at one page ahead of myself, by the G20 group of experts, the group of experts. So, okay. So the key is to use securitization, where you bundle things together and you can buy them. UNCTAD opens the door to this. There's a discussion by their group of experts in 2017 where that was discussed. I was not there that year, missed that year, but they said, yeah, let's look into blended finance because this was something that was moving. So this is just a blah, blah, blah let's check it out. But blending finance has only raised somewhere around $81 billion globally. Now, if you look at UNCTAD's numbers, they'll come up with a number like $3 trillion. Now, it sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but it's 3% of global GDP. So, it's a lot of money, right? Because it's a big job. But this number here is nowhere close. So it has to get bigger in scale if you're going to use this mechanism, and it has to be done in the right way. Now, planning has moved on. Now we're onto the G20. And a three-tier system is now being installed and was celebrated in Glasgow. Some of these fools made, who's that Canadian that was the head of the central bank? Carney. This fool said, we have made, good Lord, he picked a number that the Financial Times pointed out was bigger than the capitalization of the entire planet. And it's like, come on, Mark Carney, get your head out of that nose candy. But in any case.
Thank God we're trusting him to look into the environmental issues.
Damn it, that's right, I forgot. Yeah, we're safe.
He's the head of the Financial Stability Board.
Yeah, thank
They
you.
do shadow banking and climate finance.
So, yeah, so this guy, so he goes and here's the three system, the G20 eminent persons group, making global financial system work for all. Go check it out. It's got beautiful graphics, little like birds fluttering around. It's really nice. So here's their three-tier system. At the top, the IMF, of course. The IMF's going to be a financial surveillance group. Next tier, they'll be joined up and they'll shift the IFIs, especially the multinational development banks, are going to shift into loan guarantees and underwriting, and so do the multilateral. Then, so this means the World Bank and so on. The World Bank becomes an underwriter, and we let the financial sector take all the profits from the fees they're going to make by creating loans and selling those babies off. Because why not? They're such nice guys. These loans on the third level would then be made and securitized on a local basis to encourage entrepreneurship. I know it's kind of you can't make this stuff up, right? So there was this report that was I was part of the 2018 meeting where I think 18 we talked about this. Might have been 19, This well-meaning person from ODI in London summarizes, okay, if you're going to do blended finance, here's what you need. You know, you've got to reorientate the international financial institutions. You got to have more developed banking projects by developing capacity for state-of-the-art national infrastructure planning and execution. That's what Rogerio pointed out is missing, but it can be developed, right? No problem. Develop syndication and securitization using mega funds as a key financing model to crowd in institutional investors, deliver affordable foreign exchange and political risk hedging by scaling up successful IFI seeded, these are her words, seed funded providers. She's a master of this rhetoric, and deepen pension and life insurance markets in domestic economies. Now, she was there, and so were some of these other experts. They had gone to Wall Street before that November meeting. Again, I forget if it was 2019 or 18. I think it was 18. They had been to Wall Street and tried to sell this model. And basically, after 90 minutes, the mega banks, Chase and them, walk out of the meeting. They're like, oh, hell, listen, we're not interested. It's too slow, it's too particular. We need to make money fast. You have all this little boutique stuff. You have all these individual projects. You want us to pull all that into harmonized securitization portfolios where we can make a shitload of money. And by the way, oh, and the underwriting is going to be complicated too. How are we going to ensure that the Philippines are going to underwrite? Oh my God, are they going to do it, or do we have to have our professionals? They didn't want to do any of that. They walk out of the meeting. And then 2 years later in Glasgow, bang, blended finance. Huh, what's missing from that picture? I don't know, coherence. So, I mean, you know, Jamie Galbraith gets so mad at all this that he just talks about control fraud. And you're tempted to go down that road, but we have to be careful because, you know, we have children and our children have children and you got children and Nina Kaltenbrunner has children and, you know, we got responsibilities. We can't walk away from this shit. So deja vu all over again. And one other thing I worry about is the Brady bonds. So, okay, this suggests that development finance is finally modernizing, making the switch from bank-based to market-based credit. But securitization was widely used since the 80s. Brady bonds took defaulted Latin American loans off those banks' balance sheets with contributions from the Treasury and the home governments. 160 billion in Brady bonds were negotiated for those countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Standardized secondary market facility made them liquid. By 1990, you had a whole emerging market bond market, and that was reached 1.7 trillion in 94, peaks at $6 trillion in 1997 until the little thing called the East Asian crisis, and then it grows to 6.5 trillion by 2008. Secondary market trading is a form of financial market surveillance, right? I can sell my Brazilian bonds if Brazil gets out of line with a little adventurous Keynesian style fiscal policy. And so basically, blended finance gets highlighted at Glasgow as a fix. It's kind of a crime. And just to say, let's kind of skip through this. Basically, they haven't met their targets. Basically, expectations that blended finance can bridge the SDG financing gap are unrealistic. Billions to billions is more plausible than billions to trillions. Now, these are British policy analysts. They have that nice British, you know, very neutral, unreasonably, unrealistic. So 2 pages on the pandemic and on SDRs, maybe 3 pages. I'm at an hour and 9 minutes. I'll be done in 6 minutes. Sorry for that. So SDRs are an international reserve asset to supplement the foreign exchange reserves of countries. Let me just kind of talk you through this rather than do all this. Basically, they're allocated, they're this extra currency that's allocated without eligibility criteria, but SDRs are only available by the IMF's constitution on the basis of who pays in their dues. And and it's heavily weighted toward the global North nations who pay most of the money. So when you talk about, well, we can do these, and I've got a page here that shows you, okay, check it out, if you can see that. Far right column, last three numbers. Basically, overall, 28% of, this is as of 2020, before the 2021 allocation, 28% of the overall SDRs are utilized, but then go up. Developing countries, developed countries, only 13%, developing economies, 47%, and then there's kind of a split there, as you can see. So basically, what we need is SDRs that are assigned to the developing countries to go the other direction. And basically, here's the proposals that have come forth. The G20 and IFIs, they want to channel these unused SDR allocations to developing countries through IMF lending facilities, such as their Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. They have a genius for making these things up. A newly proposed Resilience and Sustainability Trust that would allow vulnerable middle-income countries to get into the game, because that's a problem too. Latin America, right, is mostly middle income, except for Chile, who's upper income, because they're special. But use SDRs then, thirdly, to enhance the capital of regional development banks. The main drawback is that these things are proposed with conditionalities. So they remove the basic character of SDRs, which is that it's not debt. You can just use it. And so they will offer lower interest rates, but what the heck. So the UNCTAD has proposed that we need to do more. I'll leave this alone. It's in their latest trade and development report. And basically they're like, we need to expand this a lot. And there's a lot to be said about that. And let's just go to conclusion. 2 pages and I'm out. Post-crisis literature on global financial crises argues that deregulated flows of global finance constitute an unstoppable force that limits the autonomy of national macroeconomic policy. The structural features of the global macrofinancial system are not considered in these mainstream explanations. Why not? 2 reasons. 1, the lack of a Keynesian analytical foundation. Secondly, inattention to the problems of stratification and social power, which, as we have seen, are drenched in historical oppression and exploitation. Latin America's subordination, currency instability, the withering of manufacturing capacity, dependence on foreign capital and currency, is a consequence of its history, amplified by asymmetric structures of global financial power and of trade and commodity linkages. The support pillars sustaining this system, which creates and recreates global financial fragility and imposes stagnation and losses on people throughout the world, the global mega banking system and the key currency central banks, remains in place even as the political foundations of the global order give way. As Hernandez Sen's first and most recent work shows, these power imbalances and their asymmetric consequences are rooted in histories of imperialism and colonialism. Read Hernandez Sen. As Eugenia Correa's last article highlights, the coronavirus crisis brings us closer to a day of reckoning. Adding the pandemic strains on public fiscs to pre-existing stresses brings global tipping points into view. Political paralysis and crisis in global North nations have hardened their policies toward immigrants and refugees at precisely a time when global South nations' provisioning capacity is threatened as never before. And let me quote from Eugenia's last published article, as far as I know, that intersectional divides provide pre-made categories for the dehumanization that provides a last savage resort for a humankind unable to free itself of neoliberal disorder. As these authors have starkly put it, we are now at the crossroads. Now, okay, there's the final, so this is like the exit music. Article this morning, Financial Times. Sovereign debt architecture is messy and here to stay. Deal with it. By Mark Sobel, former U.S. Treasury official and IMF representative, double hit, responsible for international monetary and financial affairs, now U.S. chair of COMFIF. Look it up. Okay. With severe sovereign debt distress now entrenched and more to come, many analysts and practitioners want to revamp the architecture for sovereign debt restructurings. To do this, they are offering reform proposals often incompatible with the facts on the ground. The current architecture is undeniably a messy hodgepodge, but market practitioners shouldn't expect major changes and focus instead on the improvements that can realistically be made. One long imagined sweeping solution is to create a global bankruptcy regime, which, by the way, we called for in the UN at UNCTAD meetings, and I think 2018 with Kingsman and so on. It's nice though, as the IMF's proposed sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, that's cool because actually it was an UNCTAD proposal and we got those suckers to take it on board, so that's good. You see a little, every now and then you see a little shift. But the current world order is based on nation states with differing legal, political, and economic systems, not global governance. Supranational bankruptcy enforcement requires a globally recognized supranational bankruptcy authority, and that does not exist. A global bankruptcy regime is a non-starter for further reasons, including possible politicization of decision-making, and that the United States would not likely cede the sovereignty of US courts in core areas to a supranational body, nor would others. Thank you, my friend. Now, let's go back to the heroic senator from Missouri. That's him on that famous picture, but have you seen the picture next to it on the top there? That's him escaping, riding down an escalator, and then actually, I've got the sequence wrong. He's basically left to right. On the bottom there, he's running out of the building. That pool is running out of the building. His Harvard degree. Meanwhile, there's the January 6th committee. There at the second from the left on that top photo is the Republican Liz Cheney, who stood up to the Republicans. She just got voted out of office in the home state of Wyoming. The bottom two pictures, that's the big screen. And as you can see, they are doing serious business about that. But here's my last piece. Can a nation state whose citizens deny the truth of reality and are willing to destroy their own political rule of law and social order to keep or regain power, hope to remain the guarantor of global financial order? Where does this leave the people of the global south? What happens to our hopes for pushing back on climate change and provisioning for our children? Where's the public power to force global finance to do its part in saving the planet? And with that, I am out. I'm at 117. Sorry for going over.
Questions, doubts?
Absolutely.
Any questions?
Everybody likes to be enough. Just make him stop.
Well, I have a quick question. Big fan of what you said today. Can you tell us where you see inequality as a result of what you're talking about? What kind of inequalities comes out of that?
There's a few sources.
You mentioned, in previous talk, you mentioned predatory lending and that kind of stuff.
The predatory lending in the subprime crisis takes wealth out of communities and renders people more vulnerable. Then the stagnation forces people out of the labor force. I really am not sure. I don't think the United States is fully employed, but that's another story. Meanwhile, those migrant workers and economic migrants, as they call them, pushed into California and other places, Mexicanos, brasileños, people from Central America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they are basically vulnerable. They are there. Why? Because of these dynamics and the way that they played out. A lot of people try to support their families. And so they are subject to basically force because they've got no backup. And you've seen what a mess Trump made of the border. So there's dimensions of inequality There were great progress when I lived in LA and in the US before the subprime. They were, like janitors and cleaning workers were organizing and all this. And so there was some agency, especially even by undocumented workers, who were taking back a right, and all that's gone now. So that's one special corner of that. Other questions or observations? Please, I'm sorry, I probably was too enthusiastic. Robert?
I mean, I love your talk too, very much, nicely complimentary with mine as well. But I was never clear about, when you recounted this whole story about blended finance, how you felt about it. Because there was a certain ambiguity, unless it's just my own projection, because I have this ambiguity. I was going to ask you about that, right? I've been thinking about this idea of a global governance structure with a progressive finance dimension, how that would work. I've talked about the SDRs, there's other, and the blended finance, that proposal in Glasgow, it's like, that's to me not the same as 2 or 3 years ago. That's a commitment to do something.
Yeah.
And Harvey is not so one-sidedly, the man has had his own transformation. So, within the left and the American left, I mean, anytime I talk about progressive finance, Galbraith brings out a baseball hat and hits me on the head. He's murdered me for that a couple of times already.
Yeah.
But don't you think that the left needs to think about that and then also like organize a group, kind of a coalition of the willing, but there's a progressive set of forces that push for that? Or is that not part of the politics of the future?
No, I think that coalition of the willing, and something we used to call greenlining, where there are some lessons from the community movement. A big debate over the years. Now, I was a community organizer before I was an economist, and so I spent some years in these movements. A big debate we always had was, okay, these bastards, these big institutions, they won't deal with us. They won't make loans to us. So should we basically put pressure on them to deliver? Because we had little legislation that we could, that the CRA, much as this fool misinterpreted it, and it's been used into a whipping boy for the woke or some goddamn thing. Much as that's been happening, we did have this tool, especially in the Community Reinvestment Act. Every time a bank wanted to merge with another, they had to prove that they were not evil people in whatever market areas they were involved in. So they had to do public hearings, and you had a chance to at least call them to account. More than nothing. And community movement, we knew how to make noise, right? So that was good. So one thing was make them accountable. The other point of view was to say, screw it, they'll never be accountable. Let's just set up a fund and have them pay into a fund and have at least the people that are our friends do that. And I'm sure that like in green finance, they're having that same debate and so on. And, I think that actually there's no one solution, but like maybe both. But first of all, you have to bring this money to the table. And secondly, that, we could say some very idealistic thing. Let's stop tax havens. Let's.
But there's an agreement against tax havens. Right? There's a fat guy. There have been measures, right?
But they're not operationalized. So basically,
it's not a French account. My French bank was bananas if I don't report to the Americans about my tax status. My French financial.
Exactly. Yeah, they'll come after you. But
yes.
but that's not the case with good old London grad, et cetera. And the UK is the biggest tax haven. They love me when I talk about that. That's a tax haven society. So I think in some sense, blended finance, the notion that there has to be private participation, and they do need to take some of the risk, I think. And the other thing is that this notion that sovereign nations, I'm sorry, I was beating on your Philippines national government, the notion that that's okay. No, hell no. That's where let's look at other capacities at the IFI or other level. And there's where, again, those linkages between the mega banks and the US Treasury and the representatives that are in those institutions are very strong. And so we need to break down some of those things. I think, I wish I had a cleaner answer, but just to say, we need accountable and responsible finance. We have seen the dangers everywhere, and I know that our good friend is now working in Chile, right? She's back home, Stephanie. And to me, Stephanie's always a little bit starry-eyed when it comes to development banks, because we watch, I mean, I remember sitting on the 24th floor of BNDES between the development bankers of China and India at a big conference with Karjim and Mazzucato and all these people in 2014. And we were writing the history of the future of the world, blah, blah, blah. Development banking was going to change everything. And like, you know, just a short time later, that whole set of possibilities evaporated because those development banks depend on progressive governments committed to keeping them in power or to doing good things. We always got the dependency, which is why we cannot afford to lose the political battle. And I wish it was cleaner. I wish it was cleaner, but I don't think we can think of, because you know, was I invited to the expert panel? How about, okay, well, you don't know enough, Gary. Okay, I accept that. How about Danielle Gabor? She is smart. They don't want Danielle Gabor at the table. She's going to find all the holes, you know, and so we're not going to be at those tables if they make the global experts. They had another panel after the subprime crisis, and you know, like for people like us, we get to share the knowledge, but there's where we say, let's keep the history in mind, and that the reparations is an interesting card. I got a student from Ghana who's working on that now, on linking the green with the reparations, and it's a complicated path, but it's just like that's true for everything. But you know, we have to hold finance to account. We also have to shrink that damn system and take all that speculative income out of it. And for that, man, you know, we do need endogenous money. If you go to 100% reserve banking, you're going to throw yourself into dependence if you check it out on the securitization system, which is owned by other people. So be careful about that. You need banks that are locally and regionally responsive, that are supported. Hyman Minsky, actually, there's a thing I used to talk about at Levy that was basically just celebrating an idea that Hyman Minsky had about community development banking. It was a pretty progressive idea, which was completely ignored. It was done by Dimitri and them for the request of the U.S. Treasury as Clinton came to power. And then Clinton's people completely ignored it. But there were some pretty good ideas in there about basically using what they call greenlining to bring money into the inner cities. Had they done that at scale, you are not going to have a subprime crisis. In fact, 1992, that market's not even there. But basically 1992 is when we had just done our big redlining study, had been released in LA in 91, 91, November, 92, April, the city burns. Clinton walks through the neighborhoods and they're like, oh yeah, here's South Los Angeles. And by the way, there's stores here and there's like buildings and people. Like, so come on, Bill Clinton. And he's like, make America great. What was it? It's about the economy, stupid, or whatever he said.
Yes.
But they set up their CDFI fund, and they have a bidding thing, and it's so badly structured that LA does not even qualify as one of the 20 cities that got the money. So, you know, just the disconnect between urban policy, inner city people's problems, and the national leadership of the Democratic Party and of the Republican Party, of course, is historic and unforgivable. But where the hell are you going to go? You got to forgive them and help them get past their own limits, because we got no other option, not in that country. Just like we got no other option than to try to get the Labour Party out of its tribalism in the UK, or here to get the PT up and running as something like a functioning party again. Democracy, people. Okay, other questions or thoughts?
Yes, I don't know if it's a question or just
reflection. I don't know if you remember, the first time that I met you, it was in 1997, when we had the quasi-Keynesian, the first quasi-Keynesian conference at New York at and Fernando organized that conference. And since then, we have 25 years, right?
Yeah.
And I have attended several times your lectures here in Campinas, in Porto Alegre, here in Berkeley, in Kansas City. And I must confess, it is the first time that I saw you present a lecture with wisdom and many emotion. Given that, and look at this last slide, when you present 5, 6 questions. My point is, are you becoming pessimist like me?
Malcolm X, again, if you read the newspapers, they're going to start believing that the oppressor is the oppressed and vice versa. I think we got to speak truth to power. And the problem is, what is that truth? We can go to the point of the contradictions and the stresses and some of these things, but then what's that next step? For what do we insist? And I got to tell you, talking to people in UNCTAD is a torture, because these are smart, well-meaning people, just like the people in the Leeds City Council and the West Yorkshire and the other people we work with locally, and the people that I've worked with in the U.S. over the years, and people in favelas here in different cities in Rio and in Brazil. And you don't want to let folk down. You're the expert. So they're going to ask you, what do we do? And Minsky, I had several years there where he'd bring us, some of us young ones, like Fazari and Faye and Ray and so on. And for those 5 years that he was there before he died, 96, and he'd walk around Levy and he'd go, Dymski, what's the model of the model? And then he'd walk away. Like, that's high, right? What a character. But then he'd say things like, takes a number to beat a number, takes a model to beat a model, takes a plan to beat a plan. Now, Bruno, brilliant young man. And we got, my other brilliant young man, he left because he's had enough of me. And, that's a question. Okay, Hyman Minsky, what is a model? What should I do? Should I try to take a DSGE and screw around with it so that Roger Farmer will say, oh my God, you're right? Or do we build an even more elaborated, SFC model that's even more heavy and full of stuff? Do we go micro foundation? Somebody's talking about principal agent. Do we go agent-based model, complexity, as was discussed the other day? I think all these models only get us part of the way, but they're languages. We need languages to discipline us and allow us to talk to each other, to bring the politics in, and I'm not sure of the mix. But the other part, let's add what Minsky never said, it takes a plan to beat a plan. Because Minsky, in the end, he was trying to sell himself right to the mavens of Wall Street. So he had this, like, it's Schumpeterian, and it's a little bit like Bresser Pereira. It's Schumpeter and it's Keynes and it's everything, it's all good. And that was Minsky too. But okay, Hyman Minsky, let's have socialism for our time. What is the plan to beat the plan? Now, when it was said earlier today that the US has a plan and Europe has a plan, I'm sorry, Fidel, they don't. Their plan is to keep this shit show on the road. They don't have a plan. And to support the people that have the big money. That's all they got. So what is our plan? And there's where I think, as much as we have sessions on research, I think we need sessions on planning. I am going to be here for your presentations tomorrow and Friday. I am committed. Why did I go to the UK? Because I could no longer train doctoral students in the US. Why? Because UC Riverside basically lost its heterodox character So I could come across and train some wonderful young people like yourself. It wasn't much training, just a few lectures. And basically I could reconnect with that next generation. And holding spaces open, my responsibilities are two right now. One is to protect, remember, that game we played when we were kids. You got to protect the fort, protect your base. Make sure that places that are responsive and sympathetic to heterodox ideas remain open and strong. That's number one. Number two, train people who can fill those places and do your best to liberate them and set them free. You heard what Jay said, and he was a little bit touchy-feely what he said, you know. So do what you want to be and do what you want to do. Well, okay, yeah, whatever. But also learn discipline, learn how to talk to each other with discipline. And while I appreciate you saying that I got emotional today, and I did, we have to be cool when we debate with each other. Respectful and listening. Hear the other. That person, they got their own mind. They've been thinking their own thoughts. And when I asked you some years ago, Fernando, is Lula's government Keynesian? And he said no. He was being honest. He wasn't being nice. And I had to hear that and feel my hopes crushed. Because I keep hoping. I went to this country the first time, it was like 97, right? I was like, okay. At the time I was married to I had been married to an African-American woman. My two kids are biracial. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go to the post-racial society. Oh no, I don't think so. And then Lula comes and it's going to be the PT government, going to solve everything. And then I go to BNDES and I give a course with these professionals in the Brazilian public service, and they are being cross-trained into a developmental state that was taking itself seriously. It was inspirational. And it's mostly gone now. It's got to be rebuilt. So that's going to be our task. Lula is going to be weaker than he should be, but let's rebuild. We've got to get busy because, you know, Roberto, I don't know if you're going to have kids one day, but, you know, why not? Give you somebody to think about, worry about at night when you're like, whatever happened to. But just joking, but the idea that we don't want to think that we're the last generation. None of our kids, none of Silvana's and my 5 kids have children right now. And we talked about that. Are we the last generation? We can't think that way. Brazil, let's invent what we need. All right. Other questions? I think there was one over there.
First, thanks a lot for your presentation. You show us a very simulating way of put things together, connect points, as you say in one of the papers. And I want to have a question that something that comes in my mind at the point of considering the anti-imperialist concerns that I totally agree that you put at the beginning. It would not be better if the emerging countries try to build something different from the actual international monetary system and try not to change it, but try to, from outside, to force it to change. And I'm thinking about the initiatives that China is leading, like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Bank of BRICS, and another forms of other forms that China is financing different factories and infrastructure in different parts of the world. So I'm wondering if it would not be a better way to try to make finance work in a way that would be better for emerging countries to face their challenges. Not try to, I don't think for the North, they have to do something with their own financial system, but I think from our point of view in the South, I think it would be better to try to build something to challenge the actual monetary policy.
Yeah, I like the direction you're thinking. And actually, if you're interested in China, please take a look at the book by Isabella Weber called How China Avoided Shock Therapy, I think. Escape Shock Therapy. Very interesting book. Great young scholar. She's at UMass Amherst now. But I think we have to admit that the Belt and Road Initiative is very complicated. China the CCP has got its own problem, which is to feed and meet the expectations of its people. They've got resource needs and so on. As you go down the tick box, and I think that there's asymmetries of power are always possible when the resources flow one way, not another. And I think it's also the case that you have a lot of control from the center so that understanding exactly what's happening on the ground is problematic. So that lack of transparency, I mean, in the UNCTAD meetings, the Chinese representatives, man, you can see them dialing it in. The rep will get up there and go, "We don't give you fish, we teach you how to fish." And you're like, oh man, that's such a cliche, but that's, I mean, literally that very thing was said. And it's like, okay, so I'm supposed to, is that a cone? Am I supposed to unwind that and take something away from that? What the hell does that mean? If I'm sitting in the Philippines, okay, so if you create like a 1 billion person population, you can run your own aggregate demand-based strategy? I don't think so. But but that's what that is that's caution. We're just here. And like when we did our vote on that multilateral sovereign debt renegotiation thing, we brought that to a vote, of course, in that meeting. And we didn't hold our breath. We knew that China would support us, and they did. But, so I think that there's a role there, but I think it's trouble. We're about to take in somebody from the CCP graduate school is about to join me, I guess, at Leeds in her sandwich year of doing a PhD. So I'm very curious. There's been a few Chinese students floating through, and I'm very curious to see how we dialogue, because I think that's a huge question. Because, Africa is a complicated map, and Latin America is a complicated map. We now got some progressive leaders, and there was some discussion about the idea of kind of Latin American fund. Remember Lula, and there was that rivalry with Venezuela and all of that. It kind of went, and it was kind of taken, well, okay, the BRICS Bank's going to be run by China. And suddenly it's kind of like another thing. It's headquartered in China, right, in Shanghai. And so it's like, I don't think that was exactly the thing, unless that's done with sincerity. So I think if there can be, do you remember who was the foreign minister under Lula? He's a Copacabana guy. Yeah, amazing person. And like, if we can get people of that caliber at the table in those conversations, I mean, we used to see him in the local Cafaina. We were like so proud, like, yeah, that's our neighbor, but that, it's like really smart people from a couple of these countries that have just elected progressive governments at the table. Let's make some progress. I'm with you. I think that that's got to be part of it. And then let's reach out to people in Southeast Asia. Let's reach out to people in other places. India is a problem now with Modi, of course. But we have to start somewhere. Okay, I probably said enough on that.
Any other question? Thank you very much, Gary.